Hi, okay, I am finally back, and I wanted to actually do three book reviews all in one go because these are the most recent books that I have finished, and I decided to really think about the topics that I found kind of similar in two of the books that I read, and also a book that really resonated with me during this time. So let's go right into it. The first book that I wanted to cover was John DeLillo's White Noise. And honestly, this was the book that encapsulated all of my thoughts and my fears, anxieties, loneliness, grievances, and even just like sexual tendencies, to be honest, during this time of this pandemic period that we have been living under. And what's really interesting is John DeLillo published his book in 1985. All right, so this was a pretty it was a postmodern fiction, and it won a lot of awards when it was first published, like almost 30 years ago at this point. And I think it's just like really fun to look back and see how like modern his writing is. For me, what really made this book so relevant to today was precisely the prose. It was very much like almost like a Twitter feed. I know that that sounds really bizarre because it is a novel, but there are so many like fragmented storylines and the ways that the characters interact. It's just so fun. Like, for example, the main character, he's like a father and he has two kids. And so during a dinner discussion, the father would be talking about, one of his coworkers by the name of, let's say, Dawn, and then the kid would be like, "Oh, wow, it's, dawn outside." And then they'll just like play on these words, but then like go into these like storylines of, well, I don't think it's dawn actually outside, says the other kid. Or like, for example, they'll just keep like bantering about like something that's totally irrelevant from what was brought up in the beginning. It's just like very fun and entertaining to see how the author kind of hones in on so many different like narratives in one single novel. And the novel itself is separated into three parts. The first part is really just like setting the scene. We're put in a fictional college town where the father himself is teaching, and he is a professor of Hitler studies. You did not hear me wrong. It is literally something that, so the father, Jack Gladney, he proposes a curriculum and establishes a department for Hitler studies in the American Studies department, I believe. And so it's just like kind of also a ironic and like tongue-in-cheek perspective of academia and like the ivory tower. There's like this type of commentary that the author, he is kind of talking about just like the ways that academia can be so distanced and removed from everyday life. And specifically, we can see how the main character, he feels a little insecure as a professor in his department, and so he is he basically dresses himself up in like cap and gown and thinks about like this watch that he wears and like how that might make him look more established, and how the ways that he carries himself also becomes like a protective shield. And the second part of the novel, it goes into something really interesting, which is the second part of the novel is titled The Airborne Toxic Event. And what that means is the characters are placed into a apocalyptic crisis of a toxin that becomes like infiltrated into the region, and so they have to basically abort and leave their house. And this entire process and the way that the scene is described is just so similar to the way that we live today, I would say, because there are just like so many different messages and signs that the characters are trying to deal with, and they like get really caught up with the semantics. of like, oh well, like what is this toxin, is it even a toxin, or like how do we know that it's like not safe to stay in our house? If we're driving, wouldn't that expose us more to like the outside air? Like all of these different thoughts, because no one really knows what's actually going on. And I think that's like so similar to the ways in which news is being channeled today, where we just hear like so many voices in and out, and we really never know like where the sources are coming from and if it's true or not. And I wanted to highlight actually a specific, verse in the actual novel itself. Let's see. So they're going into like the safety area right now. So they're like the characters are driving to out of their house. They're starting to really seep in to think about like the crisis and like this moment. And then the dad says, I feel sad for people and the queer part we play in our own disasters. Okay, so that right there, I think really like just summed up this moment for me in 2020 going on to 2021, about how in this like very catastrophic moment, we in our own heads can like really play a really big part in like how difficult the crisis is. And then going a little bit further, right, he says, which was worse, the real condition or the self-created one? And did it matter? This question is so relevant to right now as we speak, right? So is this pandemic that we're living under worse than our self-created like moments and just like awareness of this whole entire situation? And also something else I want to point out is John DeLillo in this novel, he plays a lot in terms of the real, the simulated realness, and this sort of like hyper realness. And what I mean by that is that sometimes the real situation is kind of covered, or like it's kind of lost in translation as people try to describe the real thing with language, and as it's spread through rumors, it becomes, augmented through technology and channeled through different realms into this hyper realness. And something that he really does a good job in is playing with this idea of like simulations. Everyone likes to joke like, oh, are we living in a simulation or is this real life? And in this novel, he actually makes a play on that specific question by saying that the like recovery officers and nurses in this like toxic event, they're brought to their emergency, and when the main character goes up to talk with one of the officers, their name is actually simuvac, which is short for simulated evacuation. And I think it's so interesting because the officer goes to say that, yes, we are definitely helping and trying everything in our capacity to help everyone here under this current situation. However, we are also learning as simulation officers. And isn't that just like so inverted? Because usually people go into simulations to prepare for the reality. But here, the officer is saying, we're using the reality to prepare for disaster simulations in the future. And I just think that was like so bizarre, but also like not too far away from the way that we live today, which is definitely caught up in our own minds, in our own realities, in our minds, and not really knowing exactly how we would approach something when it actually does happen in the quote unquote real life. Okay, and then lastly, I wanted to point out like just other very fun passages in this novel. So here, this was like a little bit earlier on. It says, when times are bad, people feel compelled to overeat. All right, like there's no like, I guess, additional layer of interpretation here. I just wanted to say that this is so relevant. Another passage I wanted to point out is here, Jack and his family, they're trying to leave the recovery station because sirens start blowing up again. Okay, so they come across a car, and the bumper sticker to the car says, gun control is mind control. And then it says, in situations like this, you want to stick close to people in right-wing fringe groups. They've practiced staying alive. All right, I don't know what John DeLillo was thinking about in this situation when he was writing, but I thought it was so funny, like playing on politics, and it was just so tongue-in-cheek again. Like I just love his writing because it's, yes, in this like imagined narrative novel, but there's so many different commentaries. Like, everything is there and it's so fun to read because again, it's so relevant. So the next book that I wanted to share that I read was Kafka on the Shore by Haruki Murakami, and actually the first Murakami book that I've read. I know that he is a really famous Japanese author, and a lot of his books, or most of his books, have now been translated in multiple languages, including English. And this book was published back in 2002, so it's been a while, and it was actually a really great immersive experience for me. I would say that it was a lot of magical realism. Like there was a lot of folklore and like ghostly elements within it as well. In terms of the main character, Kafka, he is a Japanese like teen. He's like 15 years old, and like the realistic plot is that he's moving out of his childhood home. He's like running away and trying to just like seek independence in a way. And then there's also a secondary character who like has his own storyline called Nakata, and like we kind of learn, it kind of goes back and forth between the two characters. And I really liked the way that the author kind of superimposed like historical elements into the novel as well. Like there are elements of like post-war Japan in like the 1940s and 1950s era, and he uses like fictional war documents. So I don't think that they're like specifically like that tied to history, but it reads as a history fiction in some parts. And kind of interesting because I always like it when there are different forms of the writing. So there are like letters in the book, and there are also reports and documents. And so it's always really cool to see how they are embedded into the storyline. And so in a lot of the beginning elements of the book, I was really drawn to reading Kafka's narrative and then also reading into Nakata's narrative, and then how they somewhat converged towards like the latter half of the novel. So, it's really great to get really tied into these characters and read into their individual perspectives of what's going on. And then I would also say that there are some like pretty triggering and like gruesome elements in the novel. So like there was one part where I was very viscerally repulsed. Okay. I am not going to reveal because I feel like that would kind of spoil like that part of it was just very alarming. Okay, almost like graphic it was in terms of like the imagery that was described. So I think that was really great on Murakami's part because he captured that description or like whatever was happening so well, to the point where I was like honestly like holding the book out as far as this because I didn't know how to take it. And as always, I wanted to like highlight some parts of the novel that I really enjoyed. So here, really short, is just a description of Kafka describing a girl that he met on a bus. And it says, asleep, she looks like a young child. One pointy ear peeks out from the strands of hair like a little mushroom, looking strangely fragile. I just love it because, we see a lot of metaphors, similes being used, but it's always really enjoyable for me when I see authors from different cultures sharing their own similes, right? So here we see that they're comparing a strand of hair to a little mushroom. I think that's really sweet. That's all. And then, okay, something else that I really enjoyed in this novel, especially during the latter half of it, the characters are placed in a library. And a lot of the scenes and descriptions, and at one point, Kafka lives in the library. Like he lives on the second floor of the library. And so the setting itself is immersive. And, you know, being a book reader and, you know, a book channel, I think it's super cool when books themselves share or like they pay homage to the house, like to where books are housed. So here they're describing the book collection, and Kafka is reflecting. When I open them, most of the books have the smell of an earlier time leaking out between the pages, a special odor of the knowledge and emotions that for ages have been calmly resting between the covers. I think that's so cool because, you know, even though we read a lot of ebooks, there's something very visceral again, or like very gratifying when you pick up a book that kind of captures the ages that it's been held and stored. Okay. And then, I mean, overall, I would say that this book was a really great escapist novel. Like, I really felt like I was in a different time and like reading a like almost cinematography of this other world. I would say though that at the very like last few chapters, I kind of felt like it was veering towards mythology and folklore a little too much. Like it started becoming really surrealist in a way, like very dreamy, and it becomes where Kafka starts dreaming, and then he actually it becomes real life, and then what's real life becomes the dream, and it just keeps flipping back and forth, and I just felt like it was a little redundant, and it kind of lost track of it then because I like it was so confusing to see what was real or like track what was unreal that I just kind of like gave up and just started reading to finish the novel, if that makes sense. So that's the only like drawback that I sense in the latter half of the novel, but I would say for the most part it was really beautiful experience to really ride the narrative out until the end. The last novel that I wanted to go over was the book Almond by Sohn Won-pyung, and it's a Korean novel that was published back in let's see 2017, but actually it only became available in English in 2020. This is actually a very different novel from anything that I've really read before because it's, you know, written in the first person of a teenager in Korea who has a underdeveloped form, like medical condition called alexithymia, which is a brain disorder in which people can't identify or even experience emotions in like a normal way, so they're kind of like detached from really any sort of feelings. And so this whole entire novel, we're hearing the perspective of this boy who goes through multiple traumatic experiences, and he kind of describes them in just like a very matter-of-fact way. You as the reader still feel these descriptions and like really disheartening situations that affect this main character in a very like substantial way, but he just takes it as it goes. It's jarring in its own way. And like even though these descriptions are more simple and matter of fact, it doesn't actually pull away because the author really does a good job in grabbing your attention even with this simple prose. So for example, again, I wanted to pull from a simile. His back slowly curled like a shrimp's. All right, so I'm not giving you any context, but just even simply looking at this relationship between someone's back and being compared to the shrimp's back, I think that's like super interesting again because we don't see these type of comparisons, and it's so simple, but like I just think it's so different from any type of like analogy that I've seen before. And then let's see. Okay, so here the main character, he's talking about how he doesn't really understand situations or like the world, but how books are different. He says, but books were different. They had lots of blanks, blanks between words and even between lines. I could squeeze myself in there and sit or walk or scribble down my thoughts. It didn't matter if I had no idea what the words meant. Turning the pages was half the battle. And something I forgot to mention was, again, in this novel, interestingly enough, a lot of the setting is taking place in a used bookstore. The author's mother used to own a bookstore, and then it was passed down to him. We see like just like the interesting ways that we can feel nostalgic of books and the stories that they hold. So overall, this book is really short actually. So I would say that if you're looking for something that's fairly different and more of a character study of someone who has alexithymia, it does bring you into just like some sort of awareness of what like people who have like are part of this, you know, spectrum would maybe feel and like go through. So yeah, that was it for this one. And I wanted to say thank you if you have decided to stay for this long. Really appreciate the time that came over these videos, and I hope to see you in a future one. And peace out. Oh my gosh.